It's great to welcome everybody back to our third session. As you remember, we started with Uncompromising Vision, incredible story of Mary Elizabeth Garrett and John Shaw Billings, and how Mary Elizabeth Garrett battled Gilman, but because of her guided philanthropy, was able to raise the standards of Johns Hopkins and admit women. John Shaw Billings, the architect of the whole thing. We then talked about exemplars for generations and Popsy, William Welsh, and the great philosopher Sir William Osler. Today we're going to talk about sacrifice in the name of science, and we're going to talk about two of my favorites. William Stewart Halsted, probably the greatest surgeon North America has ever produced, and Jesse Lazear, who gave his life in the name of science. As before, I have no disclosures, and again, a caution on biography as history, quoting Osler, and what more delightful in literature than biography, and yet how uncertain and treacherous is the account which any man can give of another's life. And again, if you really want to dive deep into medical history, I strongly encourage that you look at the Department of History's online courses that they offer. They have some really fantastic ones. For this lecture, I want to give a special thanks to my friend and colleague, John Cameron, who is clearly the world's expert on Halsted, and so much of what I'm going to show is borrowed from him. So without further ado, so again, last time we talked about Popsy, Welsh, and Osler, and today we're going to start with Halsted. And note in the painting, some people have hypothesized he's fading a little bit in the background, and we'll talk about why. So William Stewart Halsted was born in New York in 1852 to a very wealthy family. And here you can see him as a young boy. Many people don't have portraits of themselves at that age, giving you a sense of their wealth. And in fact, Halsted's grandfather, the first mayor of Chicago, Ogden, named, I think it was called Egypt Street or Egypt Avenue, after Halsted's grandfather. And so one of the longest streets in Chicago now bears the name of Halsted. He grew up in New York, in Manhattan. I think this is a picture of him in Central Park. You can see an energetic and youthful young man. He goes to Yale College as an undergraduate from 1870 to 1874. And I love his recollection of his time at Yale. Devoted myself solely to athletics in college. And this probably isn't an understatement. People have looked at the Yale library, and they are not able to find any evidence that he checked out a book from the Yale library in college. He was, as noted, very athletic, and he's shown here in the back row and in the center, and in fact was the captain of Yale's, the first football team with 11 players, and scored the winning touchdown in the first game in which there were 11 football players against 11. So American football started with Halsted. He was also on the baseball team, and you can see him here in the back right, muscular and vigorous student at Yale. After graduating from Yale, and remember from the previous lectures, there were no admissions standards for medical school at the time. He goes to Columbia, or the College of Physicians and Surgeons, which is currently called Columbia University in Manhattan. He graduates at or near the top of his class, and then went to Bellevue for further training. And you can see him here in this picture at Bellevue. There, he was what they call a house physician, and developed a temperature chart. So when you go to the doctor, you're hospitalized and they have the chart that maps your temperature. I guess it's now Epic. He started it all. And it was in fact, at Bellevue that he met William Welsh, our medical great from last time. But he then did what many young physicians do to get additional training, as Welsh did and as Osler did. He traveled to Europe to train with the greats. And as they did, he amply absorbed the idea of science applied to medicine. And so here's a famous picture of famous surgeon Bill Roth, and you can see the many people following or observing Bill Roth. There's a long list of names here in the slide. The particulars aren't important, but again, the fundamental idea that this talented young physician traveled to Europe, and in Europe absorbed what they were doing in Europe and brought it back to America. Then we come to the New York phase of his life, or the New York Halsted. He was amazingly bold and daring. And I'll give a couple examples. In 1881, his sister develops uncontrolled bleeding following the delivery of a child. They call Halsted to say goodbye to her, but he stops the hemorrhaging. She's still lost a huge amount of blood. What does he do? He takes a needle, plunges the needle into his own arm and withdraws blood, and then directly transfuses it to his sister. There was no matching or crossing typing of the blood at the time. He just took his own blood, repeatedly withdrew it, and gave his sister his blood. So probably one of the first transfusions in the United States he did on his sister. He's really, really bold and daring. Give another example. The following year, his mother was desperately ill. He is called to her apartment in New York and finds her jaundice. She's yellow. She has a biliary obstruction and has tenderness over her gallbladder. So he diagnosed an infected gallbladder, and he did what any of us, I'm sure, would do, is he operates on her there in her apartment at 2 a.m. In the morning. By candlelight, he opens her gallbladder, drains pus from the gallbladder, removes 7 gallstones, and she lived for several years thereafter. And this is probably one of the first surgical removal of gallstones performed in the United States. Again, it was performed in her kitchen on the table at 2 in the morning. So an amazingly bold and daring surgeon operating at multiple hospitals. He was also outgoing, full of enthusiasm, popular, and at ease. He entertained in his apartment with his roommate, Thomas McBride, and a description, a delightful companion of gay and cheerful disposition. And we're going to compare this to the Baltimore Halsted later. William Welsh, the pathologist, was always welcome and joined them at some of their gatherings in the apartment. But he was also a scientist. Remember, he had absorbed the scientific method in Europe. And to set the stage, before there was anesthesia, surgeons, a good surgeon was a fast surgeon, right? If the patient was awake, it was not how accurate you are with your sutures, it was how fast you were. And so surgeons made their cuts. Here's from Ether Day, the book. As the surgeons made their cuts, the boy's screams were so full of misery that everyone who could left the room. The boy watched with, quote, glazed agony as the saw cut through the bone in 3 heavy passes. And so these were the surgical instruments in the mid-1840s. And even though ether was introduced in 1845, many surgeons continued to operate quickly. And I had a wonderful lunch with my colleague Steve Akoff and John Cameron and Neil Grauer last week. And John Cameron mentioned how dangerous surgery was at the time. And there's a famous operation done by Robert Liston, who was one of the fastest surgeons at the time, one who could take off a leg in just a matter of minutes, who would make a quick cut with a knife, put the knife in his mouth, and then saw with the saw. And this famous case in which there was not only did the patient die, but there was a 300% mortality, to give you a sense of how rough surgery was. Liston amputated the leg in less than 2.5 minutes. He also accidentally amputated the fingers of his assistant with a sharp knife. Both the patient and Liston's assistant died from infection they acquired during the operation. And the story varies, but apparently he threw kind of his knife back like this, and one of the spectators either fainted or died of a heart attack. This fast surgery was dangerous surgery. And so Halsted, having learned the scientific method, wanted to change that. And so in 1884, he read a paper in the medical record by Henry Noyes, in which he reported on the work of Karl Kohler and Sigmund Freud, of the famous Sigmund Freud, in which they describe how if you put cocaine in the eye, you can touch the eye. It anesthetizes the eye. So he's a scientist. He recognizes that the problem that we need to make surgery painless. And so he then begins to experiment. But in that article in the medical record, there's a line that I think is particularly important. It remains, however, to investigate all the characteristics of this substance, and we may yet find that there is a shadow side as well as a brilliant side to the discovery. So Halsted reads this, reading the scientific literature, he tries to solve the problem. And so he himself and gets his colleagues together, and it's described here in the medical record in 1884. They start to experiment on each other, injecting each other's nerves with cocaine, and then showing that they can anesthetize that part of the body. And so when you go to the dentist and they anesthetize your nerve, that's Halsted. And so in the medical record, what they did is described: a body of gentlemen in the city composed of willing medical students and intelligent surgeons have been experimenting with a view to determine the hypodermic effects of cocaine when applied directly to the sensory cutaneous nerves. In 20 minutes after the introduction of 15 minims of 4% solution, all the parts supplied by the anesthetized nerve were rendered analgesic. The constitutional effects, vertigo, nausea, were mild and transient in character. If the inferences deduced from these observations are correct, this property of cocaine to affect all the nerve terminals when applied to a particular nerve must prove of great service for the performance of many major as well as minor surgical operations. So a real advance in surgery. But unfortunately, not recognizing it was an addictive substance, Halsted and all of his colleagues became addicted. And only Halsted and one colleague who then went to California survived, lived through this addiction. And Halsted reported their experience in the New York Medical Journal in 1885. And John Cameron has pulled out, this is a single sentence from Halsted's publication on the effect of cocaine. And I can read it to you. It's impossible to read. Remember, this is a single sentence. Neither indifferent as to which of how many possibilities may best explain, nor at yet a loss to comprehend why surgeons have, and that so many, quite without discredit, should have exhibited scarcely any interest in what, as a local anesthetic, had been supposed, if not declared, by most so very sure to prove, especially to them, attractive. Still, I do not think that this circumstance or some sense of obligation to rescue fragmentary reputation for surgeons, rather than the belief that an opportunity existed for assisting others to an appreciable extent, induced me several months ago to write on the subject in hand, the greater part of somewhat comprehensible paper, which poor health declined me to complete. So this is you can get a sense of his mental status at the time. So his family brings him to Butler Sanatorium in Providence, Rhode Island. They bypassed the sanatorium in New York because Halsted's father was on the board of those. And in 1886, and then again in 1887, he's institutionalized. So if you can imagine going from the peak of surgery in New York, the peak of social life in New York, to being institutionalized in a sanatorium in 1886. And you can only imagine the quality of care at that time. So what did they do at Butler? They tried to douse the flames of cocaine by giving him morphine. And so they treated his cocaine addiction with morphine with the hope of helping him to overcome it. So he's in the sanatorium in New York, and the hero of every story, of course, is a pathologist. And the hero of this story is William Welsh, who we met last week. And so Welsh, remember, is now down in Baltimore. He's the director of the Department of Pathology. And what does he do? He invites his friend, his dear friend, out of the sanatorium to come down to Baltimore and to work with him. And Halsted then does some brilliant research. So now we're in December of 1886. Welsh invites Halsted to come down to Baltimore, and Halsted begins a series of really quite remarkable experiments. Again, taking that European idea of science applied to medicine and applying it here. And the problem he wanted to solve is intestinal surgery. At the time, if you were to do an intestinal anastomosis, sewing, let's say you took out a piece of bowel and wanted to sew two ends of bowel together, all too often the anastomoses came apart, spilling the intestinal contents into the patient's peritoneal cavity, and they would die a terrible death. So this is the scientific or the medical problem that Halsted wanted to conquer scientifically. So he collaborates with the anatomists. Remember, we mentioned briefly Franklin Mall, who came to Hopkins because of Welsh. And so Halsted and Mall begin a collaboration trying to tackle scientifically a medical problem. And so the issue was that surgeons were putting their sutures into the muscular wall of the bowel. But as anyone who's looked at muscle in the grocery store, muscle easily pulls apart, right? The fibers of muscle. So if you try to suture it, you can imagine the sutures just coming out. And this is in fact what was happening. They studied the intestines microscopically, and at the top would be the lumen of the bowel. Here's the epithelium. The muscle is at the bottom. And they noticed that the submucosa had these haphazardly arranged fibers. They weren't arranged in rows, and they hypothesized that a suture placed there might hold better. And so they tried this first in dogs, putting the suture not in the muscular area, but in the submucosa. And indeed, the sutures held. And really a major advance by scientifically studying the problem and identifying a solution. And so Halsted is in many ways the father of alimentary tract surgery. And again, it's because taking that scientific method and applying it to a surgical problem. So he's doing well, and Osler, Sir William Osler, writes this letter to Gilman, the president of the university, now in 1890, and I've highlighted the key part here. Halsted is doing remarkable work in surgery, and I feel that his appointment to the university and the hospital would be quite safe. So they now make Halsted the chairman, the director of the Department of Surgery, the first director of the Department of Surgery at Johns Hopkins. And he revolutionizes surgery. He applies the scientific method to surgery. He studies how wounds heal, how infection can be minimized. He is very focused on safe surgery. Again, at a time where many surgeons, even though there's general anesthesia available, even though ether had been around for decades, are still operating quickly with little concern for blood loss, as if the patient were alive and screaming. And I've listed below some of the major advances he made by scientifically attacking a problem in surgery: hernia repair, the removal of breast cancer, bile duct surgery, the resection of periampullary cancers, subclavian artery aneurysms, the first to use a plate and screws for bone fractures, and so on. And so here's one of Max Bradel's drawings of Halsted operating on the thyroid gland, something that was felt to be too dangerous because of the many nerves and blood vessels that are near the thyroid. And you can just see the immense care of the surgery, contrasting that to the amputation, if you will, that we saw earlier. And I love this, showing the beautiful closing of the surgical wound. So very interested in the delicate handling of tissues and in anatomy-driven surgery. And he was not followed by many, and I love this. Charles Mayo of the Mayo Clinic came to visit and watched Halsted operate. And this quotation, "Watching Halsted operate was the first time I ever saw the upper half of an incision heal before the lower end was closed." He was just too slow for Mayo. But this is, of course, what's needed. You don't go to a surgeon today and say, "Doc, how fast are you going to be?" You're interested in how careful that surgeon is going to be. And Halsted started all of that. The three great evils were surgery were eliminate pain, hemorrhage, infection. The three great evils which had always embittered the practice of surgery and checked its progress were in a moment in a quarter century robbed of their terrors. And you can see Halsted operating here. So to contrast the before and after, let's go back to the Eakins painting of Gross. And remember, we saw this before because Gross's son is in the background here. He's the one who married Lady Revere and then died, and the widow married Osler. But here in the Gross clinic, you can see Gross operating. The terror of surgery is there. The patient's mother, the boy's mother, is in the background, screaming or crouching in terror. The assistants are holding down the patient, and you can see the blood squirting. Compare that to Halsted, the delicate handling of tissue, the precision, the beauty and the art of surgery. But he didn't stop there. He then introduced his residency training program to surgery. Prior to opening of Hopkins, there were no formal systems to train surgeons. Remember John Shaw Billings and his training. Halsted introduced a university-sponsored hospital-based surgical training program that trained surgeons who were knowledgeable in anatomy, pathology, bacteriology, physiology. These were scientific surgeons. Over time, as they progressed through, they would be given more and more independence. Many of Halsted's trainees went on to become department directors themselves, so promulgating the messages that Halsted had and spreading it throughout the country. And then many of his trainees went on to start subspecialties. And you can see his trainees here. Remember, we talked about Harvey Cushing, one of the fathers of neurosurgery. Young is here, one of the fathers of genitourinary surgery. Crow, one of the fathers of head and neck surgery, and so on. So he taught young, and they were all young men, and they went out and started their own surgical programs modeled on the Halsted model. And I love this picture. It's of John Cameron, who I think was the fifth chairman of surgery here, giving a talk of Halsted, and you can see the message of Halsted being channeled through Dr. Cameron to the next generation. He also introduced rubber gloves to surgery, surgical gloves. He fell in love with his scrub nurse, Carolyn Hampton, shown here. And at the time, in preparation for surgery, the scrub nurses and the surgeons would wash their hands, and they would soak their hands in permanganate solution for many minutes, which would turn their skin an awful color. So then they would decolorize their hands in hot oxalic acid and then soak their hands after that in vats of corrosive sublimate. And so you can imagine this was terrible on their hands. And so Halsted wanted to protect Carolyn's hands. And so he wrote to the Goodyear Rubber Company, and they devised gloves for him to use in the operation. And so here you can see Halsted operating with the surgical gloves. Note that not everyone picked up on it at first, but of course today they're used, and they not only protect the patient, but they also protect the surgeon. Because at the time, if the patient had an infection and the surgeon cut their hand, the surgeon could acquire the infection and die from it. So he introduced rubber gloves to surgery. But there was a price to all this. And now let's contrast the New York Halsted to the Baltimore Halsted. And Harvey Cushing, in his obituary that he wrote in Science, a magazine about Halsted, wrote, a man of unique personality, shy, something of a recluse, fastidious in his tastes and his friendships, an aristocrat in his breeding, scholarly in his habits, caring little for the various gatherings of medical men. And contrast this to remember how he was in New York, unassuming. He spent his medical life avoiding patients, and when health permitted, working in the clinic and laboratory at the solution of a succession of problems which aroused his interest. What a dramatically different person he is now in Baltimore. As he described, he was fastidious. Here he is in High Hampton, his summer place. And I love this picture because he's in his summer place, but look how he's dressed. And there are his dogs, Nip and Tuck, on the chair, and appropriately named for dogs of a surgeon. He was fastidious. He would iron the tablecloth on the table before he had guests. I'm told that many people in fact do that. But another example, he would choose the individual coffee beans that would be ground to make coffee for his guests, picking out the ones he felt weren't that appropriate. I know you're saying, well, a lot of people are careful about their coffee. He even had his shirts laundered in Paris because he felt there wasn't a good launderer in Baltimore. So very, very fastidious. So why was that? Why this dramatic change? And if you go to the board minutes, here we can see a report noting the absence of Dr. Halsted was referred to the executive committee to the report to the next meeting of the board. So clearly he was not well in Baltimore. And if we turn to the secret or the diary that Osler wrote about Hopkins, the seal was broken, and we can do that now. He asked for it to be sealed for 50 years, I think. And we can see what he wrote about Halsted. And let me type that out for you here. The proneness to seclusion, the slight peculiarities amounting to eccentricities at times, which to his friends in New York seemed more strange than to us, were the only outward traces of the daily battle through which this brave fellow lived for years. When we recommended him as full surgeon to the hospital in 1890, I remember I showed you that letter, I believed, and Welsh did too, that he was no longer addicted to morphine. He had worked so well and so energetically that it did not seem possible that he could take the drug and do so much. About 6 months after the full position had been given, so he's now chairman of the department, I saw him in a severe chill, and this was the first indication I had that he was still taking morphine. Subsequently, I gained his full confidence. He had never been able to reduce the amount to less than 3 grains daily. And a grain is a grain of barley corn in weight, about 64 milligrams. If you and I were to take 3 grains quickly, it could kill us. It's quite a lot of morphine. In this, he could do his work comfortably and maintain his excellent physical vigor, for he was a very muscular fellow. I do not think that anyone suspected him, not even Welsh. So in his entire time at Johns Hopkins, the 30 years that he ran the department, he was a secret morphine addict. He dies in 1922, so 30 years after he came. Very ironically, remember he did the gallstone surgery on his mother, and he did the blood transfusion, he gave it to his sister. So how does he die? He himself develops gallstones, one of which is stuck in his bile duct. The trainees who he trained and now gone on to lead departments came back to Baltimore and tried to operate on the old man. He began to bleed after surgery, and one by one, his residents lay down beside him, stuck a needle into their own artery, connected it to tubing and into his vein, and gave him a blood transfusion. He dies of pneumonia weeks after surgery. And so this is from a dinner honoring Halsted, and you can see them putting him on the wall of the great surgeon. And if you remember Bill Roth, who he trained with, you can see the B and the OTH here honoring Halsted. So when I think of Halsted, I think of science applied to medicine, and I think of victory wrought out of the very elements of one's own defeat. Also I think of dedication to a friend. And Halsted's widow, Carolyn Halsted, wrote this to William Welsh after his death. I sometimes wonder if you have any idea of the great love and admiration that Dr. Halsted had for you. He never mentioned you without praise. Most of us meet with adverse criticism from those who love us best, but I never heard him ever say anything but what a true friend you had always been to him, and how much you and all your work meant to the Johns Hopkins. He often said, Welsh is the Johns Hopkins. Without him, it would be nothing. He has been the best friend to me that any man could ever be. And what dedication when you're starting a new school of medicine to take your friend out of sanatorium, to risk everything on your friend, and to let him grow in the new institution. I'm originally from the University of Chicago, and the emblem, the crest, is the phoenix. And I think of Halsted when I see this, kind of a beautiful bird that dies and is reborn from the ashes, from the flames, a more beautiful bird. And if you think of Halsted, if it weren't for his addiction, he probably never would have come to Baltimore. He probably would have remained in New York, operating day and night, hosting gregarious gatherings. But because of addiction, it changed him, and he came to Baltimore and effected a revolution in surgery. Let's move on to our second great, Jesse Lazear, and we're now moving forward in time. This story, I think, is appropriate it has lessons for us today, because this is about the battle against yellow fever. And so let's go back in time. The yellow fever, a virus, it causes often fatal acute hemorrhagic disease. The virus belongs to the flavivirus group, which includes West Nile virus, which you hear about today, and dengue fever. It causes jaundice, and hence the name yellow fever, severe abdominal pain, and the vomiting of blood. And so it's called El Vomito Negro. And a name that I think describes how the patients felt. They often have protein in the urine because of the severe kidney damage. And so here you see a patient suffering from yellow fever. The first case of yellow fever in the United States is in 1648 in the Yucatan. In 1702, 10% of the population of New York died from yellow fever. 10%, if you can imagine that. In 1793, it struck Philadelphia, and 5,000 people, or 10% of the population in Philadelphia, died of the disease. And for those of you who are fans of the musical Alexander Hamilton, he contracted it as well. People tried a variety of approaches to treat it. Benjamin Rush, the famous physician, declared that it was caused by poisons escaping from foul piles of coffee near the wharf. He advocated aggressive bleeding of patients. And I love this quotation: Rush made one of the great discoveries which had contributed to the depopulation of the earth. Because of course, bleeding was probably the wrong thing to do for these patients. The various therapies that were tried: avoid infected people, avoid fatigue of the body and mind, dress according to the weather, avoid intemperance, stop tolling bells, burn gunpowder, and use vinegar and camphor liberally. They even went so far as to firing cannon through the street to chase away the contagion. Ben Franklin, again commenting on the ineffective therapies, said that people only got better after the doctors had run out of medicine. There was no way to treat this. Again, the parallels of yellow fever with today's COVID-19 pandemic. Governor Mifflin of Pennsylvania blamed foreigners on yellow fever. There was a conflict between public health measures and businessmen, where the public health, they were trying to close roads, and businessmen insisting that they be open to allow business to function. And the exhaustion of physicians, just as we see it today. Quote, old Saul was left all last night entirely alone in a hospital. This morning, he cried like a baby, treating patients suffering from yellow fever. But there was an attempt at trying to identify what caused it, to bring science to bear, if you will. And Carlos Juan Finlay used weather data and geographic features to suggest that mosquitoes were responsible for the transmission of yellow fever. And the response for many novel scientific ideas, as this was universal ridicule. And I'll go on a little bit of a tangent, but this reminded me of the story of Helicobacter, the bacteria that causes gastritis. And as many of you may know, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren won the 2005 Nobel Prize for discovering that that bacteria cause gastritis and gastric ulcers. And I love this, talking about how novel ideas are sometimes received in science. On the right, you see a letter Dr. Marshall applied, sent his abstract describing this discovery in to the Gastroenterological Society of Australia. And I love this part. I regret that your abstract wasn't accepted. The meeting abstracts we received continues to increase for this meeting. 67 were submitted, and we are only able to accept 56. His was in the bottom 11 abstracts submitted. That's how it was received in medicine. And something that will, as we move forward, in fact, to prove that the bacteria cause ulcers, after this rejection, Marshall later drank bacteria cultured from a patient who had gastritis and then himself developed severe gastritis. So self-experimentation. But let's go back to yellow fever. So now in 1898, the United States takes Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and the Philippines from Spain. There were fewer than 400 men killed in action. Over 2,500 died from disease. And in Cuba, yellow fever is running rampant. In 1898, the town of Siboney, Cuba, is burned down to kill yellow fever. They burned down the entire town to try and get rid of it. But so who do they turn to? Of course, they turn to one of our heroes, William Welsh, and ask him to bring science to medicine to solve this problem. And so many of Welsh's trainees are now brought to bear. So George Sternberg was a fellow at Hopkins in bacteriology under Welsh. He went to Brazil and helped disprove bacteria as a cause of yellow fever. In 1893, he's appointed the Surgeon General. Walter Reed, I think many of you recognize the name, is born in 1851 in Virginia. And I love these stories about why when people went into medicine back then, his father could not afford to have 3 boys go to college. So they sent Reed to the shorter medical school because it was cheaper, less expensive than college. And Walter Reed graduates in 1868, the youngest ever to graduate from the University of Virginia. He joins the military corps while at Camp Apache. He adopts a Native American girl and he moves multiple times. But some of those moves bring him to Hopkins, and he trains at Hopkins under William Welsh. The third part of the yellow fever board is Jesse Lazear. He's born in 1866 and here in Baltimore, goes to Johns Hopkins as an undergraduate, and then Columbia University for his MD and PhD degree. He comes back and he's a pathologist heading the clinical labs here at Hopkins, and he also is influenced by Welsh. So they put him in charge of the hospital laboratory in Cuba. So they form a yellow fever board in 1900 to tackle the problem. And the 3 names I bolded there, Reed, Jesse Lazear, James Carroll, were all trained under Welsh here at Hopkins. And here's Jesse in Cuba. And their approach is first to show that it's not a bacteria, to disprove that. They look at the blood of patients with yellow fever and cannot identify a bacteria. And then they wanted to know, is the disease transmitted by mosquitoes, or is it person to person by bodily secretions? There were no animal models. And so in order to distinguish between those 2 modes of transmission, they recognized they would have to use humans. And quote, the serious nature of the work decided upon and the risk entailed upon it were fully considered, and we all agreed as best justified we could offer for experimentation upon others to submit to the same risk of inoculation ourselves. And so they voted and decided to not only experiment on volunteers, but to experiment on each other. If they were going to ask someone else to do it, they had to be willing to risk it themselves. So to prove the mosquito theory, they obtained the mosquito eggs from Finlay. Remember, we met him earlier. They had the mosquitoes bite infected patients. They then incubated them 11 to 14 days and had these mosquitoes then bite non-immune volunteers who had had no previous contact with yellow fever. To disprove the person-to-person transmission, they had several buildings and they would infect them with sheets, blankets, pillowcases, purposely soiled with liberal quantity of black vomit, urine, and fecal matter. and volunteers then stayed there from patients with yellow fever. And then the volunteers stayed there, and they had mosquito netting up so they couldn't get bitten by mosquitoes. They even went so far as to have volunteers wear the soiled clothing of people who had died from yellow fever. And here are some of the huts they used. Can you imagine spending 20 days in that hut with the vomit and having to wear the clothes of people who've died of yellow fever? But the other group were bitten by mosquitoes. And so Lazear took the mosquitoes, they called them birds, to the hospital to feed on yellow fever patients, and they called that loading the birds. They then let the mosquitoes incubate for 11 to 14 days. And James Carroll, remember one of the four, went first, and after being bitten by a mosquito, was taken to the hospital with yellow fever. But it was subsequently learned that he had had previous direct contact with patients with yellow fever, so they couldn't prove it was the mosquito that caused it. So they had some military volunteers, and Private William Dean was one of the first. And 5 days after he was bitten by a mosquito, he developed yellow fever. So they cable Walter Reed, who was back in the US, that they think they found the transmission. But one of the key early volunteers appears to have been Jesse Lazear. On September 8th, 1900, he wrote home to his wife, I rather think I am on the track of the real germ. He then develops delirium, convulsions, and black vomit. And on the 25th, he dies from yellow fever, leaving behind his wife and 2 children, including a newborn daughter. He risked it all. And here's the cable to his wife, to Mrs. Lazear. Dr. Lazear died at 8 this evening. And in fact, we know it was intentional testing. On page 100 of his notebook, Jesse Lazear wrote guinea pig number 1, and almost certainly guinea pig number 1 was Jesse. September 13th, this guinea pig bitten today by a mosquito. This mosquito bit Suarez on August 30th. And September 13th is the day that Jesse Lazear said he was bitten. So he was almost certainly guinea pig number 1. So Walter Reed, on hearing the death of his friend, comes back. They rename the camp Lazear, and now they start to get written consent for their experiments. The volunteers are paid $100 to participate, and another $100 if they contract yellow fever. And here's the consent form typed out, and it's, the undersigned understands perfectly well that they may develop yellow fever, and it endangers their life. But I don't know how well they understood. I love this quotation. When the 4th case was carried out of the camp to the hospital, it caused a veritable panic among the remaining Spaniards, the volunteers. Major Reed aptly put it, they lost all interest in the progress of science and severed their connection with Camp Lazear. In all, they infected probably 18 people with the mosquitoes. But they were able to prove that it was the mosquito and not person-to-person transmission. And they then go and try to eradicate mosquitoes. And where there's standing water, they put a little film of oil so the mosquitoes can't breed. And in fact, there was not a single case of yellow fever in Havana from September 1st to July 1902. And in his paper, Walter Reed gives a tribute to Jesse Lazear. And here you can see the letter he wrote. I think it's to Lazear's wife. He was a splendid, brave fellow. I lament his loss more than words can tell, but his death was not in vain. His name will live in history of those who have beautified humanity. A really beautiful letter. And Walter Reed, I think, wrote to his wife, "It has been permitted to me and my assistants to lift the impenetrable veil that has surrounded the causation of this most dreadful pest of humanity, and to put it on a rational and scientific basis, the science applied to medicine to conquer disease. May its cure be wrought out in the early days of the new century. The prayer that has been mine for or more years that I might be permitted in some way or some time to do something to alleviate human suffering has been answered. Walter Reed goes on to become the librarian of the Surgeon General's Library. And remember, that's what John Shaw Billings started. And he dies actually at a very relatively young age of acute appendicitis. And of course, Walter Reed Hospital is named in his honor. And if you go to the Washington National Cathedral and you look up at the stained glass, you may not notice or understand this stained glass, but I think now you can. And of course, here's Dr. Lazear's name, and you see the mosquito and Lazear experimenting on himself. And if you walk through the halls to the main corridor of Johns Hopkins, this is one of the original main corridors, and I walk past it every day, and you'll see there's a plaque on the wall that most people walk by and ignore. But if you turn your attention to this plaque, it's in memory of Jesse Lazear, graduated arts in Johns Hopkins, in medicine, Columbia University, assistant resident at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, member of the Yellow Fever Commission in 1900, with a rank of acting assistant surgeon. He died of yellow fever in Cuba on September 25th. With more than the courage and devotion of a soldier, he risked and lost his life to show how a fearful pestilence is communicated and how its ravages may be prevented. Jesse Lazear. So when I think of Jesse, I think of the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice to help fellow human beings. We're getting to the end and we want to leave 10 minutes for discussion. With William Stewart Halsted and Jesse Lazear, think of courage and devotion to humanity. And when I go to the parking garage at Hopkins, I pass this sign every day, the promise of medicine: push boundaries, create hope, serve humanity. And these two served humanity and paid a terrible price in doing so, but made a big difference. And then, of course, today, I got this from the internet, the young men and women in the trenches fighting COVID-19, my wife Claire pointed out it's a little bit different. They're treating individual patients, Jesse Lazear and Halsted, through science, helping many more. But the dedication is written on the face of this young physician. Thank you again. I note these articles. Again, I point out the one by John Cameron in the Annals of Surgery, and a special shout out to the Chesney Medical Archives, where they have just fantastic archives on history. Next week, I think it'll be a really remarkable lecture on facing discrimination. We'll talk about Dorothy Reed, Helen Taussig, and Vivian Thomas. So thank you all.